The Shard Within. The old Chevrolet coughed its last wheeze of protest before dying, not with a shuddering sigh, but with a defiant metallic gasp precisely at the edge of the choked gravel path. Evan Carter gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the worn plastic, and stared through the rain-streaked windshield. What lay before him wasn't just a house, it was a mausoleum of memory, a skeletal frame against a sky the color of bruised plums. His mother, Eleanor, had been gone for 3 weeks now. A sudden, silent aneurysm had taken her, leaving Evan with nothing but a void where a complicated, distant love had once resided, and a solicitor's letter instructing him to return to a place he had sworn off a decade ago.
The ancestral home, the letter had termed it, with a detached formality that mocked the visceral dread now coiling in Evan's gut. Ancestral it was, passed down through generations of Carters who seemed to cultivate silence and shadows as carefully as others tended gardens. The house stood like a stoic sentinel, half swallowed by the encroaching forest. Ancient oaks, their branches gnarled like arthritic fingers, clawed at the slate roof, their leaves a sodden, rustling tapestry in the wind. The paint, once a cheerful cream, had long since peeled into leprous patches of gray and green, revealing the dark, splintered wood beneath. Windows, like vacant eyes, stared out from under heavy brows of ivy, some panes cracked, others opaque with grime, reflecting nothing but the oppressive gray of the afternoon. A rusted swing set, a ghost from his own childhood, groaned softly in the overgrown yard, its chains singing a mournful dirge. Evan killed the wipers, letting the rain blur the world, as if hoping to erase the edifice before him. He was 29, a man accustomed to the sterile efficiency of city life, to the comforting hum of constant human presence. This was different. This was a silence that pressed in, thick and suffocating, broken only by the drip of water from the eaves and the distant mournful cry of an unseen bird. He felt a primordial chill seep into his bones, a premonition that had nothing to do with the damp air. With a heavy sigh, he killed the engine, plunging the world into a deeper quiet. The air inside the car grew instantly colder, laden with the metallic scent of old engine oil and the faint, sweet decay of the surrounding woods. He pushed open the door, the groan of hinges echoing disproportionately in the vast stillness. The gravel crunched under his boots as he walked, each step sounding unnaturally loud, as if the earth itself were listening. The front porch sagged, its planks warped and slick with moss. The oak door, once grand, was now a scarred and pitted monument to neglect. A thick, rusted knocker, shaped like a gargoyle's head, seemed to sneer at his approach. He found the key, a heavy, old-fashioned iron thing in his pocket, its cold metal a shock against his skin. It slid into the lock with a groan, turned with a reluctant clunk, and the door swung inward with a drawn-out shriek, revealing a darkness so profound it seemed to absorb the meager daylight. The air that rushed out to meet him was frigid, thick with the scent of dust, mildew, and something else, something ancient and still, like forgotten breath. It tasted of decay and secrets. He stepped over the threshold, and the door, as if alive, swung shut behind him with a resonant thud that vibrated through the floorboards and up into his teeth. He stood in the entryway, a vast, shadowy space. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the grimy windows, casting weak, diffused patches of light on the swirling dust motes that danced in the stagnant air. The floorboards, dark with age, groaned under his weight. To his left, a grand staircase, its banister intricately carved with swirling patterns of leaves and vines, ascended into the gloom of the upper floor. To his right, the living room door stood ajar, a sliver of darkness teasing him.
His eyes, still adjusting, scanned the periphery, and that's when he noticed it. A tall, slender object, shrouded in a heavy, dark cloth, stood against the far wall of the entryway. Its contours suggested a mirror, but why covered? He dismissed it as an old custom, a relic of his mother's increasingly eccentric later years, perhaps a way to mourn or to keep dust off. He had never been close enough to his mother to understand her habits, especially not in the decades since he'd left for college and rarely returned. He pulled his phone from his pocket, its flashlight beam a weak but welcome spear against the oppressive darkness. The light cut through the gloom, revealing the true extent of the house's dereliction. Cobwebs, thick as spun sugar, draped from every corner, catching the light like spectral lace. Furniture, draped in white sheets like sleeping giants, stood sentinel in the living room. Each covered form seemed to hold a breath, a silent presence. As he walked deeper, the floorboards complaining beneath his feet, he noticed more. In the living room, a large, ornate frame, clearly meant for a mirror, was covered with a similar dark cloth, almost black, pinned tightly at the corners. In the dining room, another, a smaller one on the mantelpiece, cloaked. It wasn't just dust covers, it was deliberate, uniform concealment. Every reflective surface, it seemed, had been meticulously hidden. A prickle of unease started at the base of his neck. His mother, for all her peculiarities, had never been superstitious. Or had she? He remembered a faint, half-formed memory from his early childhood. A fleeting glimpse of her hastily covering a bedroom mirror, her face pale, her movements jerky. He'd dismissed it then, a child's misinterpretation. Now it resurfaced, chilling him. He pushed open the kitchen door. The air here was even heavier, imbued with a faint, cloying sweetness that might have been old fruit or something far more unsettling. A single, grimy window overlooked the dense woods, now a wall of impenetrable green and shadow. The kitchen was a time capsule, a half-eaten loaf of bread still on the counter, a teacup with a dried-up residue in the sink. The suddenness of her death truly was sudden. He found the circuit breaker in the basement, a dank, earthen-smelling pit with a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Dust motes danced in its weak glow, making the air seem alive. The fuse box was old, its levers stiff, but with a series of clicks and grunts, power slowly returned to the house. The lights flickered on, one by one, with a hesitant hum, but they did little to dispel the gloom. They only highlighted the dust, the decay, the endless draped forms. Returning to the living room, he pulled a sheet off a worn armchair. A cloud of dust billowed, making him cough. He sank into its musty embrace, the springs groaning in protest. He felt utterly alone, isolated not just by distance, but by a palpable sense of absence. His mother's scent, a faint trace of lavender and old paper, still clung to the fabric, a ghostly reminder. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the oppressive silence, but it only amplified the subtle sounds around him. The house creaked, settled, exhaled. As dusk began to bleed into night, the windows turned to black rectangles reflecting nothing but deeper darkness. The sounds intensified, not loud, but persistent. A faint scratch, 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 like fingernails on wood, seemed to emanate from the walls of the living room, then move, seemingly from the dining room, then the hall. Evan froze, straining his ears. It was too regular for an old house settling, too deliberate for rodents. It carried a strange, insistent rhythm, like a secret message being tapped out. He tried to rationalize it. Tree branches scraping against the siding, a loose shutter, but the sound felt internal, reverberating through the plaster, not on it. He got up, walked to the wall where the scratching seemed loudest, pressed his ear against the cold plaster. The sound ceased. He pulled back, waited.
Silence, a profound, aching silence that made his ears ring. Then, the moment he stepped away, it began again, a soft, mocking scratch, scratch, scratch from the opposite wall. A tremor went through him. He shook his head, blaming his grief, his exhaustion, the isolation. He was imagining things. He had to be. He needed a drink, a distraction, anything to pull him from the spiraling dread. He found a half-empty bottle of his mother's ancient sherry in the kitchen, its amber liquid thick and cloying. He poured a generous measure into a dusty glass and returned to the living room, sinking back into the armchair.
The scratching continued, a maddening, elusive presence. It seemed to circle him, a phantom predator. He tried to focus on his phone, scrolling through meaningless news feeds, anything to anchor himself to the outside world. But the house wouldn't allow it. A faint whisper, like dry leaves skittering across a paved path, brushed past his ear. It was barely audible, a breath, a sigh. It sounded like his name. Evan. He shot upright, spilling sherry onto his jeans. His heart hammered against his ribs. He looked around wildly. Nothing. The whisper was gone, swallowed by the vast, dark rooms. He must have imagined it. He was truly losing it. He stood up, pacing the room, his movements agitated. The scratching paused when he moved, then resumed when he stopped. It was as if it was playing with him, a cruel game. He tried to convince himself it was his imagination, his mind, frayed by grief and solitude, playing tricks, but the conviction felt brittle, easily shattered. He found himself drawn to the entryway, to the tall, shrouded mirror. The dark cloth seemed to absorb the dim light, creating a deeper pocket of shadow. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from the fabric. A strange, cold sensation radiated from it, a stillness that was not peace, but an active, malevolent quiet. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to pull back the cloth, to reveal what lay beneath, to prove to himself that it was just a mirror, just glass, just his reflection. But something held him back. A primal instinct, a whisper of warning that was not his own thought, but something colder, older. He stood there for a long time, caught between fear and a desperate need for answers. The scratching resumed, this time closer, emanating from the wall directly behind the covered mirror. It was louder now, more insistent, no longer subtle, but a definite, rhythmic scritch, 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 punctuated by what sounded like faint, guttural snorts. It was the sound of something alive, something trapped, trying to get out. And then, from inside the covered mirror, a voice. It was soft, almost imperceptible, a frayed whisper barely above the scratchings. But it was there, and it was calling his name.
Evan. It was a distorted echo of his own voice, stretched thin, like a memory warped by time and static. It was deep, yet breathy, carrying a chilling undercurrent of desperation and something else, something profoundly alien. His breath hitched. Every hair on his arms stood on end. This was no longer his imagination. This was real. His hand, shaking uncontrollably, moved towards the edge of the dark cloth, his fingers brushing against the heavy fabric. The sound intensified, a frantic scratching, scratching, scratching from within the glass, accompanied by a low, vibrating hum that made the very air around the mirror thrum. The voice grew louder, more insistent, a broken record playing his name.
Evan, help me. It was a plea, but laced with a subtle, predatory hunger that made his blood run cold. He stared at the dark shroud, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. What was behind that cloth, and what did it want? The house, once merely old and neglected, had become a living, breathing entity, its shadows stirring, its walls whispering. And he, Evan Carter, was trapped within its chilling embrace, a pawn in a game he didn't understand, being called by a voice that promised both salvation and damnation from behind a veil of darkness. Part 2. The voice, a spectral distortion of his own, coiled around Evan, chilling him to the marrow. "Evan, help me." It was a plea, yes, but underneath, a cold current of something possessive, something ancient and hungry, pulsed.
His hand, suspended in the air before the shrouded mirror, trembled violently. The rhythmic scratching from within the wall intensified, morphing from a mere scritch to a frantic clawing sound, as if something desperately wanted to tear its way out of the plaster and into the room. The mirror itself, beneath the heavy cloth, thrummed with a low, resonant vibration, a resonant hum that seemed to shake the very foundations of the old house. His mind screamed at him to run, to turn and flee this mausoleum of dread, to leave the key in the lock and never look back. But a morbid fascination, a desperate, illogical need to understand, rooted him to the spot. His mother had covered these mirrors for a reason. Had she known? Had she heard this insidious whisper? Was this the secret she had carried, unspoken, to her grave? With a shuddering breath that felt trapped in his chest, Evan's trembling fingers finally closed around the edge of the dark cloth. It felt strangely cold, heavier than mere fabric, as if it were saturated with the very darkness it contained. He gripped it, his knuckles white, and with a sudden, jerky movement, tore it downwards. The cloth peeled away with a sound like dry skin tearing, revealing not merely a mirror, but a vast, ornate-looking looking-glass set in a heavy, tarnished silver frame. Dust, thick and gray, billowed outwards, catching the weak light from the distant kitchen window, dancing in the air like countless tiny, lost spirits. The glass itself was old, mottled with age spots and a faint, milky haze that obscured any clear reflection. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, to see past the grime and the swirling dust. The scratching behind the wall ceased abruptly, replaced by an even more profound silence that pressed in on his eardrums. The air grew colder, heavy, as if the room had just taken a deep, anticipatory breath. Evan stared into the mirror. For a moment he saw nothing but a murky, distorted reflection of the shadowy entryway, the dim lights, and a ghostly outline of himself. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass, and instinctively raised a hand to wipe away the dust. And then he saw it. Through the haze, a figure coalesced. It was him, or it should have been him. His own face, his own haunted eyes, his dark hair disheveled from the long drive. But there was a subtle, horrifying difference. The figure in the mirror was perfectly still, even as Evan's hand still moved, reaching for the glass. It was a fraction of a second, an imperceptible delay, but it was there. And then, as Evan's hand dropped, the figure in the mirror also dropped its hand, a beat too late. A cold dread spread through Evan's chest, seeping into his veins. He stood utterly still, his eyes wide, fixed on his reflection. The figure in the mirror stood equally still, its gaze unwavering. Evan swallowed, a dry, rasping sound in the crushing silence. He raised his left hand, slowly, tentatively. The figure in the mirror raised its left hand too, mirroring him, but again with that minuscule, unsettling delay. Then the corners of the reflection's mouth began to twitch upwards. Slowly, unnervingly, it formed a smile, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched his mirrored lips, showing too much teeth. But Evan wasn't smiling. His face was a mask of terror, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. The reflection's smile widened, a mockery, a grotesque parody of joy, while Evan's own face remained etched in horror. The disparity was sickening. This wasn't a reflection.
This was something else, something that wore his face, that mimicked his movements, but held its own terrifying autonomy. A faint whisper, dry as bone, slithered from the mirror. "Hello, Evan." It was his voice, but subtly altered, deeper, smoother, imbued with an unnerving resonance that vibrated in his very bones. It was the same voice that had called to him from behind the cloth, but now it felt closer, more intimate, more real. Evan stumbled backward, hitting the wall with a dull thud. His breath caught in his throat. The reflection watched him, its grotesque smile never faltering, its eyes, his eyes, holding a predatory glint he had never seen in himself. What are you?" Evan croaked, his voice barely a whisper, ragged with fear. The figure in the mirror didn't answer with words. Instead, it slowly, deliberately lifted its right hand and pressed it against the glass. Evan's heart hammered. He could feel a strange pressure on the wall behind him, a faint thrumming that was not his own pulse. Then, from the depths of the house, from the unseen hallways and rooms beyond his sight, a chorus of whispers erupted. They weren't distinct words, but a cacophony of sibilant, overlapping sounds, like 1,000 dry leaves skittering across a vast, empty floor. They seemed to swirl around him, brushing past his ears, some close, some distant, all speaking in a language he couldn't comprehend, yet understood to be malevolent. And then the footsteps began. Thump, drag, thump, drag. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the upper floor. They sounded like someone with a profound limp or someone dragging a great weight. Evan spun around, his eyes wide, scanning the gloomy staircase that ascended into the darkness. There was no light up there, no visible movement, yet the sounds continued. Thump, drag, thump, drag. They weren't receding, they were circling. They moved from what sounded like the master bedroom, across the landing, towards the guest rooms, then back again. Even as Evan stood still, rooted to the spot by terror, the footsteps continued their relentless circuit, a phantom patrol. He backed away from the mirror, his gaze darting between his smiling reflection and the dark void of the staircase. The reflection watched him, its smile now radiating an almost palpable sense of triumph. Suddenly, a sharp, sickening crack echoed from the wall next to Evan. It wasn't the sound of wood settling or plaster shifting. It was the distinct, horrifying sound of bone snapping, loud and wet, followed by a faint, guttural gasp that seemed to emanate from within the plaster. Evan screamed, a choked, involuntary sound, and scrambled away, clutching his head. Another crack, closer this time, and the wall vibrated under the impact, dust sifting down from the ceiling. It felt as if something immense and unseen was struggling or being broken just inches from him. The mirror vibrated intensely now, a low, continuous hum that filled the entryway. The figure within it, his distorted doppelganger, pressed its hand harder against the glass, and Evan could swear he saw the ancient glass flex inward, just a fraction. Its smile broadened, revealing even more teeth, sharper, longer teeth than his own. The whispers intensified, swirling into a vortex of sound around him, pressing down on him, filling his mind with fragmented, meaningless static. The footsteps above continued their relentless, circling rhythm, punctuated by the gruesome, bone-cracking sounds that now seemed to come from all around him, from the walls, from the floor, even from the ceiling. The house was alive, and it was closing in. He tried to run, to find an exit, but his legs felt heavy, as if encased in lead. He stumbled towards the front door, fumbling with the heavy iron lock, his fingers numb with terror. The key, which had seemed so solid moments ago, felt insubstantial, refusing to turn. He tugged, he twisted, but it wouldn't budge. It was stuck, or perhaps, he realized with a fresh wave of horror, it was being held. He glanced back at the mirror. The reflection had taken a step forward. It was no longer merely pressing its hand against the glass. Its entire body seemed to strain against the surface, as if the glass itself was a permeable membrane. And now, the movements of the shadow were no longer delayed. They were separate. Evan watched, transfixed, as his mirrored counterpart slowly, deliberately raised its other hand and pointed, not at him, but towards the staircase. A cold, spectral finger, thin and elongated, pointed directly into the upper gloom. Then the reflection spoke again, its voice deeper, more resonant, yet still that chilling distortion of his own. This time there was no plea, only a statement, flat and absolute. "You're not going anywhere, Evan." And with that, the figure in the mirror took another step forward, its face now pressed against the glass, distorting its features into a grotesque parody of his own. Its eyes, burning with an unholy light, locked onto his. He saw his own terror reflected there, amplified, twisted into something monstrous. A single, hairline crack, like a spiderweb, appeared on the surface of the mirror, directly over the reflection's forehead, spreading outwards with a faint crystalline chime. The sound was not of breaking, but of yielding, of the barrier itself beginning to give way. The shadow was no longer merely observing, no longer merely mimicking. It was coming. Part 3. The hairline crack on the mirror's surface spread, a delicate crystalline vein mapping out a slow, inevitable fracture. It spiderwebbed across the glass, tracing intricate paths around the reflection's distorted face, and with each new line, a faint, almost musical chime echoed in the suffocating silence. The sound was not violent, but insidious, like the slow, deliberate unraveling of a sanity. The figure in the mirror, his own face twisted into a mask of triumphant malevolence, pressed harder, its eyes burning into Evan's, holding him captive. "You're not going anywhere, Evan." The words reverberated not just in the air, but inside his skull, a chilling echo that seemed to bypass his ears entirely. It was a declaration, not a warning. Evan tore his gaze from the mirror, his breath ragged, and threw himself against the front door again. He clawed at the lock, his fingers raw and desperate, but the heavy iron key remained stubbornly immobile, fused somehow with the ancient mechanism. It was as if the house itself had sealed its exits, a living tomb. The whispers around him intensified, forming a swirling vortex of sound, a cacophony of dry, rustling voices that seemed to mock his futile efforts. The footsteps above continued their relentless, circling thump, drag, an incessant, maddening rhythm that hammered at the frayed edges of his sanity. He could feel the cold radiating from the mirror, a tangible entity pressing against his back, even though he stood several feet away. The air in the entryway was thick with a metallic tang, like old blood, mixed with the cloying sweetness he'd noticed in the kitchen, now stronger, more pungent. He spun around, his back against the unresponsive door, facing his tormentor. The reflection had moved. It wasn't just its face pressed against the glass now. Its entire upper torso was visible, pushing against the barrier, the glass groaning under the unseen pressure. The crack had expanded, a vast, intricate network now covering the entire surface like a shattered web. Yet the mirror did not break. It merely groaned, protesting, yielding. The shadow Evan raised its right hand, not to point, but to slowly, deliberately clench its fist. And as it did, a sharp, piercing crack erupted from the wall to Evan's immediate left, so close it made him jump, a spray of dust and plaster showering down on him. It was a sound of immense force, of something fracturing deep within the very structure of the house. Another crack, then another, from the opposite wall, then the ceiling. It was as if the house itself was being systematically dismantled from the inside out, its bones breaking under an invisible strain. And then a new sound, a low, guttural growl, deep and resonant, emanating from the shadowed figure in the mirror. It was not human, not animal, but something ancient, elemental, a sound of primordial hunger. The smile on its face broadened, stretching his features into a horrific caricature of joy. "Such a fragile cage," the shadow whispered, its voice now laced with a triumphant, malevolent glee, still an echo of Evan's, but colder, sharper. "So easily undone." Evan's mind reeled. This wasn't just a reflection. This was an entity, intelligent and malevolent, that sought to escape, to trade places. His mother, he realized with a fresh wave of terror, hadn't covered the mirrors to protect herself from what was in them, but to protect what was outside them, to keep it contained. And now he had undone her desperate work. He had freed it. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. He had to fight. He had to escape. He looked around wildly, his gaze falling on a heavy, wrought-iron umbrella stand in the corner of the entryway. He lunged for it, grabbing the cold, heavy metal, and turned back to face the mirror, raising the stand like a weapon. "Stay back!" he screamed, his voice raw, cracking. "Get away from me!" The shadow in the mirror merely tilted its head, its smile unwavering, its eyes glinting with amusement. "Such futile resistance, Evan," it purred, its voice a silken thread of menace. "We are already one, you and I. Soon we will be whole." It took another step forward within the mirror. The glass bulged perceptibly, a convex curve forming under the immense unseen pressure. The cracks deepened, widened, but still the mirror held, like a skin stretched to its breaking point. Suddenly, the footsteps from upstairs ceased. The whispers died down to a low, barely audible hum. The bone-cracking sounds fell silent. An unnatural stillness descended upon the house, more terrifying than any cacophony. It was the calm before the storm. Evan stood rigid, umbrella stand raised, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He watched, breath held, as the figure in the mirror slowly, meticulously, began to mimic his every breath, his every tremor. It was a grotesque rehearsal, a refinement of its mimicry, as if it were perfecting its performance before its grand entrance. Then the shadow raised its left hand and pressed it against the glass. Evan mirrored the action, his right hand, the one not holding the umbrella stand, rising instinctively as if an invisible puppet master pulled his strings. He pressed his hand against the glass, feeling the cold, smooth surface against his palm. And as their hands met, separated only by the ancient groaning glass, Evan felt a searing, electric shock course through his arm, shooting up to his shoulder, then down into his chest. It was not pain, not precisely, but a profound, invasive cold that numbed his very soul. He tried to pull his hand away, but it was stuck, bonded to the mirror as if by an invisible, powerful adhesive. Through the glass, his reflection's smile widened impossibly, revealing a throat that seemed to stretch, distend, and deep within it, a swirling vortex of shadow. The eyes, his own eyes, held a depth of malice that made him recoil even as he was physically held fast. "You feel it, don't you, Evan?" the shadow whispered, its voice now a low rumble, resonating directly inside his head, bypassing his ears entirely. "The merging, the becoming." Evan gasped, a silent, desperate sound. He felt a profound drain, as if his very essence, his warmth, his life force was being siphoned away, absorbed into the cold, ancient glass. He struggled, he thrashed, but his hand remained locked. He could feel the cold spreading, creeping up his arm, numbing his fingers, his wrist, his elbow. His vision began to gray at the edges, the room spinning. The whispers returned, now focused, distinct, and directly in his mind. He heard phrases, not clearly articulated, but impressions, fleeting thoughts that were not his own. Freedom, replace, true form. The shadow pressed harder against the glass. The mirror groaned, a long, drawn-out sound like a dying animal. The cracks expanded exponentially, a blinding white flash momentarily obscuring his vision, followed by a shower of shimmering dust like pulverized diamonds. And through it all, the cold intensified, a relentless, invasive force. Suddenly, the figure in the mirror lurched. Not a push, but a deliberate, slow step. Its foot, clad in a distorted version of his own shoe, emerged from the glass, phasing through the surface as if it were water, not solid matter. It landed on the dusty floorboards of the entryway with a soft thud, sending a fresh cloud of ancient dust into the air. Evan's mind shattered. This was it. This was the moment. The impossible was happening. His arm, still locked to the mirror by some unseen force, was now cold and lifeless, numb to the bone. He could feel his own strength ebbing away, draining into the glass, into the entity that was now half emerged. The shadow's leg was fully out, then its hip, its torso, slowly, agonizingly, pulling itself free from the shimmering surface of the mirror. It was a horrifying birth, a silent, grotesque emergence. Each movement was slow, deliberate, as if savoring the transition, testing the limits of its new reality. As the shadow Evan's head finally cleared the glass, its eyes, now fully opaque and black like polished obsidian, met Evan's. The smile on its face was no longer just a grotesque parody. It was a genuine, terrifying expression of profound satisfaction. Its skin, once a shadowy imitation, now seemed to solidify, to take on the pale, sickly hue of real flesh, though still retaining an unnatural translucence. And then Evan felt it, a counterforce, a pulling, an irresistible suction from within the mirror. The electric cold that had invaded his arm now reversed its flow, pulling him inwards, towards the shattered, shimmering surface. His hand, still fused to the glass, was now pulling him, dragging him, slowly, inexorably, towards the shimmering portal. The shadow Evan, now fully out of the mirror, stood before him, a perfect, chilling duplicate, except for its eyes of midnight. It was taller, perhaps, and leaner, with an unnerving stillness. It took a deep, shuddering breath, a sound that seemed to draw all the air from the room, and then a single, horrifying word, spoken in Evan's own uncorrupted voice, but laced with a chilling finality. "Welcome." Evan screamed, a silent, desperate sound trapped in his throat as his body was forcibly pulled, inch by agonizing inch, into the shimmering, yielding surface of the mirror. He saw his own terror-stricken face reflected back at him, but this time it was his true reflection, trapped and fading, while the newly emerged entity stood outside, whole and triumphant, its obsidian eyes watching him disappear. The cold consumed him, swallowing him into the unyielding depths of the glass, the world outside shrinking, distorting, becoming a distant, unreachable memory. He could feel the agonizing pressure of the glass closing around him, hardening, becoming a prison. The last thing he saw, before the darkness swallowed him whole, was the shadow Evan standing perfectly still in the entryway, a ghost in his own house. its smile widening into a silent, victorious laugh. Part 4. The cold consumed him. Not the ordinary chill of the old house, but a profound, absolute cold that seeped into his bones, extinguishing the last vestiges of warmth, of life. As his body was inexorably drawn into the shimmering surface of the mirror, the world outside inverted, distorted, then dissolved into a swirling vortex of black and gray. The last thing Evan saw was the triumphant, obsidian gaze of his doppelganger, standing whole and solid in the entryway, a silent, victorious laugh stretching its lips. Then darkness, absolute and suffocating, swallowed him. He was no longer falling, no longer being pulled. He simply was, suspended in an abyssal void, a realm of pure, crushing stillness. There was no up, no down, no forward, no back. Only the cold and an omnipresent pressure that felt like the weight of forgotten time. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped. He tried to move, but his limbs were unresponsive, heavy as if made of lead. He was encased, entombed. Slowly, agonizingly, his senses began to re-emerge, but twisted, warped by his new reality. He felt the cold not just on his skin, but within him, a frozen core where his heart had once been. He saw not with his eyes, but with a diffuse internal light, perceiving the faint, shimmering outlines of something. Shapes, like distorted memories, swam in the periphery of his non-vision. They were like shadows of shadows, constantly shifting, never fully coalescing. Then he felt it, the glass. He was pressed against it, but from the inside. It was cold, smooth, unyielding. He could sense the texture of the tarnished silver frame, the faint dust clinging to its edges, but it was all inverted, reversed. He was behind the looking glass, a prisoner in a reflective prison. He tried to focus, to understand. He pushed against the invisible barrier, a frantic, desperate urge to break free. But there was no give at all. Only the cold and the unyielding pressure. And then a sound. A faint scratching. It was familiar. The same incessant scratch, scratch, scratch that had haunted the walls of the house. But now it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within. He was the source. He was the trapped thing. The realization hit him like a physical blow, stripping away the last shreds of his sanity. He was the entity, the prisoner, the thing that had been trying to get out. He saw, or rather felt, a faint flickering light through the glass. It was the entryway of his childhood home, now impossibly distant, muted, as if viewed through thick, murky water. He saw him, the shadow, his double. It was standing perfectly still, its back to the mirror, its head tilted slightly, as if listening to him. The new Evan, the imposter, moved. It walked with a subtle shift in posture, a newfound confidence that was eerily unsettling. It surveyed the entryway, its obsidian eyes glinting in the dim light, and then, slowly, deliberately, it walked towards the staircase, the same staircase from which the phantom thump, drag, had emanated. Evan, trapped and helpless, watched in horrified fascination as his doppelganger ascended the stairs. Each step was solid, firm, no limp, no drag. It was moving with an unnerving grace, a predatory purpose. He could hear the whispers again, now amplified, distorted, originating from the other side of the glass. They were no longer a cacophony, but seemed to coalesce into distinct, sibilant voices, murmuring his name. Evan, Evan. But it wasn't a plea, it was a triumphant chant. As the shadow Evan reached the top of the stairs, it paused, standing silhouetted against the deeper gloom of the upper landing. It turned its head slightly, and Evan could swear it was looking directly at him through the glass, a faint, knowing smirk on its lips. Then, from the depths of his internal prison, Evan felt a profound sense of loneliness. Not just the isolation of being trapped, but an ancient, pervasive loneliness that permeated this inverted realm. He was not alone here. He was surrounded by the lingering presences of others who had been trapped, others who had watched, others who had eventually faded into the pervasive cold. He was merely the newest addition to this spectral audience. A faint, chilling whisper brushed against his internal perception. "She tried to warn you, Evan. She tried to keep us apart." His mother, Eleanor. The memory of her, distant and fractured, flickered in his mind. Had she truly known? Had she been tormented by this very thing? This entity that mimicked life? Had her eccentricity, her eventual reclusiveness, been a desperate attempt to protect him, to protect them? He remembered her covering the mirrors, not just this grand one, but others. The one in the living room, the one in the dining room, the smaller one on the mantelpiece. He was trapped in the entryway mirror, but what of the others? Were they also prisons, or were they portals? Suddenly, a new sensation overwhelmed him, not cold, but a burning, agonizing ache from deep within his chest. It was his heart trying to beat, trying to find warmth, trying to live. But the cold was too absolute. He was fading. He was becoming one of the shadows he had glimpsed. He watched as his doppelganger moved along the upper landing, its form now a solid, undeniable presence in the dim light of the real world. It entered a room, and Evan felt a faint, sympathetic shudder from his prison. That was the master bedroom, his mother's room. From within the mirror, Evan could perceive the faint, muffled sounds of movement. His doppelganger was exploring, learning, inhabiting. He saw the spectral outlines of furniture, the vague impression of a dresser, a bed, and then he saw the imposter approach another covered object, a mirror, his mother's bedroom mirror. The shadow, Evan paused before it, its head cocked as if listening. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, it reached out and, with a casual gesture, pulled down the heavy cloth. Evan's internal vision sharpened, drawing him towards this new scene. The bedroom mirror, smaller than the entryway one, was revealed, and within its surface, a faint, distorted reflection of the room and the shadow Evan standing before it. But this reflection was different. It was hazy, indistinct, shimmering with a faint internal light, and within it, Evan saw another Evan. Not a doppelganger, but a ghostly, translucent version of himself trapped behind that glass, just as he was trapped behind his own. It was not a perfect replica, but a shimmering, suffering echo. The shadow Evan in the real world smiled, a slow, predatory curving of its lips. It raised its hand and pressed it against the surface of the bedroom mirror. And as it did, the ghostly Evan trapped within recoiled, a silent scream frozen on its face. The mirror began to hum, a low, ominous vibration that resonated through Evan's own prison. "So many little fragments," the impostor whispered, its voice a soft, sibilant sound, imbued with a strange, dark satisfaction. "So many pieces of me to reclaim." The realization slammed into Evan with the force of a physical blow. The entity hadn't just been trying to replace him. It had been shattered, fragmented, trapped in countless mirrors throughout the house. Each covered mirror held a piece of it, a reflection of its true form, or perhaps a reflection of him, stolen and imprisoned. And now the true entity, the dominant fragment, was out, and it was collecting itself. It was absorbing the others. He was just another fragment, another piece to be consumed.
He tried to scream, to warn the ghostly Evan in the bedroom mirror, but no sound escaped. He felt a profound weakening, a fading of his own consciousness. The cold was deepening, the pressure intensifying. He was becoming less, becoming nothing. The shadow Evan in the real world chuckled, a low, throaty sound that was chillingly familiar. It pulled its hand away from the bedroom mirror, and the faint, shimmering reflection of the ghostly Evan within distorted, flickered, and then, with a soft internal pop, vanished entirely. The mirror went dark, opaque, holding nothing but a dull reflection of the dusty room. Another piece consumed.
Evan felt a fresh wave of terror, a visceral fear that shook him to his core, even in his imprisoned state. His consciousness was dissolving, fragmenting, becoming tenuous. He was losing himself. Then, the shadow Evan turned away from the bedroom mirror, its obsidian eyes scanning the room as if searching for something else. It paused, its gaze falling on a small antique vanity table in the corner, adorned with a collection of his mother's old trinkets. And on the table, a tiny silver-backed hand mirror, also covered with a scrap of dark cloth. The imposter walked towards it, its movements fluid, confident. It picked up the hand mirror, its fingers, so like Evan's, brushing against the rough fabric. It pulled the cloth away, revealing the small, circular-looking glass.
And within it, another reflection, not of the room, not of the shadow Evan, but a faint, shimmering image of his mother, Eleanor. Her face was pale, drawn, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. She was trapped, a ghostly image, an echo of her final moments, imprisoned within the small hand mirror. The shadow Evan smiled, a slow, cruel curving of its lips. It brought the hand mirror close to its face, its obsidian eyes gleaming with triumph. "Hello, Mother," it whispered, its voice a perfect, chilling imitation of Evan's own, devoid of any warmth, any emotion. "Did you truly believe you could contain me?" Evan, trapped and fading, watched in horror as his doppelganger raised the small hand mirror. The image of his mother within it recoiled, thrashing in silent agony. The glass began to hum, a high-pitched, vibrating whine that pierced Evan's internal prison. He felt a profound sense of despair, a crushing sorrow for himself, for all the fragments that were being consumed. The cold was now absolute, the darkness encroaching, pulling him down into the final void. He was dissolving, losing his grip on existence, becoming nothing more than a faint whisper in the glass, a memory of a shadow, soon to be erased entirely. The last vestiges of his mind struggled, fought against the inevitable, but the cold was too strong, the silence too absolute. He was becoming part of the endless dark, a shattered shard of himself, waiting for his own consumption. The high-pitched whine from the small hand mirror intensified, a grating, unbearable sound that resonated through Evan's internal prison. He could feel it, a sympathetic vibration, an agony that was not his own but deeply familiar. His mother's spectral image within the glass thrashed, her silent scream a palpable wave of terror that echoed through the abyssal cold. The shadow Evan, his doppelganger, held the mirror with an unnerving tenderness, its obsidian eyes gleaming with a terrible satisfaction. "Did you truly believe you could contain me?" the imposter repeated, its voice a perfect, chilling imitation of Evan's, devoid of warmth, devoid of life. It was a question laced with a profound, ancient cruelty. Evan, or what remained of him, was fading. His consciousness, a flickering ember in the absolute cold, struggled against the inevitable. He was a prisoner behind the grand entryway mirror, a ghost within the glass, watching his own slow annihilation. The cold was now all-consuming, a tangible entity that pressed in from all sides, threatening to extinguish the last spark of his awareness.
He felt a profound weakening, a dissolution of his very being. He was becoming less, becoming nothing more than a faint whisper, a memory destined to be erased. He watched, helpless, as the shadow Evan brought the hand mirror closer to its face, its lips parting in a grotesque smile. The image of Eleanor within the glass seemed to shrivel, to shrink, her spectral form contorting in a final, desperate struggle. The whine reached a crescendo, a sound so high and sharp it felt like needles in Evan's fading mind. Then, with a soft, almost imperceptible pop, the image of his mother vanished. The hand mirror went dark, opaque, reflecting only the dull, dusty room. Another fragment consumed, another memory erased. The shadow Evan let out a soft, satisfied sigh, a sound that was disturbingly human. It looked around the room, its obsidian gaze lingering on other surfaces, a framed photograph, a polished wooden tabletop, even the gleam of the old teapot on the dresser. Everything that could reflect, it seemed, held a piece, a shard of its ancient fractured self, or perhaps a shard of him. The distinction blurred. Was the entity merely collecting its own scattered essence, or was it consuming the souls of those it encountered, trapping them, fragmenting them, becoming them? Evan felt a horrifying realization bloom in his dying mind. The entity wasn't just replacing him, it was an echo, a mimicry, a parasitic hunger that fed on identity itself. The shadow Evan, now complete, now truly solid, turned its gaze towards the grand entryway mirror directly at Evan. Its eyes, once his own, were now pools of impenetrable darkness, deep and boundless. A slow, knowing smile spread across its face, a smile that conveyed absolute triumph. "It is done, Evan," the impostor whispered, its voice now fully formed, rich, resonant, a perfect replica of his own, but steeped in an ancient, chilling power. "The pieces are gathered, the vessel is whole." Evan felt a final, agonizing surge of cold, a burning pain that ripped through his ethereal form. He was being pulled, dissolved, absorbed. He was fighting, screaming silently, thrashing against the unseen bonds that held him. But it was useless. He was fading. Suddenly, a memory, sharp and vivid, pierced through the encroaching darkness. A childhood memory. He was 7 years old, standing in this very entryway, his mother's hand in his. He had been crying, scared of a thunderstorm. She had bent down, her face etched with a strange, deep sadness, and whispered, "Look, Evan, look into the glass. See your strength. See your courage." He had looked, and for a fleeting moment he had seen not just his reflection, but a faint, shimmering outline behind it, a shadow that moved when he didn't, a darkness that seemed to watch. He had cried harder, pointing, but his mother had quickly pulled him away, her face pale, and then, later that day, he remembered seeing her covering the mirror for the first time. She wasn't trying to keep it in, she was trying to keep him out, to protect him from seeing the truth. The truth was, the mirror had always been a portal, and the entity had always been there, waiting, watching, learning, and he, Evan, had been its unwitting target from the very beginning. His mother hadn't been trying to contain a monster. She had been trying to prevent her son from being replaced by one that looked exactly like him, one that had been lurking in his reflection since childhood. The shadow Evan in the real world took a step closer to the mirror, its gaze fixed on Evan's fading form. Its smile widened. "Your mother was a fool," it hissed, its voice imbued with a new venomous edge. She thought she could keep the true heir from his birthright. Birthright? Heir? Another memory, fragmented, terrifying. A whisper from his childhood, a forgotten lullaby from his grandmother, tales of a family curse, of seeing too much in the glass, of children who changed and disappeared. He had dismissed them as old wives' tales, morbid folklore, but now he saw it.
Not just his doppelganger, but a faint, translucent image behind it within the real world. A flickering, almost imperceptible shadow, an echo of the true entity, the ancient, formless thing that had always been there, within the mirrors, within the family line, passing down its hunger, its ability to mimic and replace. It wasn't just a shadow, it was the shadow. The shadow Evan, now perfectly solid and real, reached out with its hand, its fingers brushing the surface of the mirror, directly over Evan's fading face. This time, there was no pulling sensation, no shock of cold. Only a final, absolute silence. And then, Evan Carter was gone. Dissolved, erased. The mirror, still cracked like a shattered web, now reflected only the dusty entryway, the dim lights, and the figure standing before it. The figure that looked exactly like Evan Carter, but with eyes that held the silent, boundless depth of the abyss. The newly formed Evan Carter, the imposter, surveyed its surroundings. It walked with a confident, measured stride to the front door, the very door that had been stuck, the key immovable. It reached out, not fumbling, but with an assured grace, and turned the heavy iron key. It slid smoothly, silently, with a soft clunk. The lock disengaged. It pushed open the door. The rain had stopped. The air outside was crisp, clean, imbued with the scent of wet earth and pine. The moon, a sliver of white, peeked through the tattered clouds, casting long, eerie shadows across the overgrown yard. The imposter stepped out onto the porch, taking a deep, shuddering breath of the night air. It felt good, real, solid. It looked back at the house, its eyes lingering on the grand entryway mirror, now merely a cracked pane of glass, reflecting nothing unusual. A faint whisper, dry as bone, seemed to emanate from the depths of the house. "Welcome home, Evan." The imposter smiled, a genuine, warm smile that would fool anyone. It was perfect. The mimicry was complete. The vessel was truly its own. It closed the front door behind it, the heavy oak swinging shut with a soft, final click. Then it walked towards the old Chevrolet, its engine now silent, dead. It opened the driver's side door, slid behind the wheel, and with a confident touch, turned the key in the ignition. The engine, which had choked and died hours ago, now roared to life with a smooth, powerful rumble. The headlights flickered on, cutting through the darkness, illuminating the dense woods and the long, winding gravel path. The new Evan Carter put the car in reverse, backing slowly down the path, away from the old house. The house, silent and dark, stood sentinel, its vacant windows watching. As the car turned onto the main road, disappearing into the night, a single, faint scratch, scratch, scratch echoed from deep within the walls of the old house, from behind the grand entryway mirror. It was soft, desperate, almost imperceptible. A new prisoner, trapped in the cold glass, was trying to get out, and the family curse, passed down through generations, had found its latest victim, its newest vessel, now free to walk among the unsuspecting world, a reflection that had become chillingly, perfectly real. The cycle had merely turned, and no one would ever know.